Good morning, good afternoon, and I don't think there is a good evening anywhere yet. So we'll stick to the morning and afternoon. Thank you all for coming and being a part of this conversation. I am really excited. And to introduce myself, my name is Suman Roy, and I am the executive director of Meal Exchange. Some of you might know about this organization, and if you don't, by the end of today, you will. Let's put it that way. And I will be your host and the moderator for today's dialogue, promoting food security in higher education. And this is one of our passion, and we have some amazing topics to discuss in the next hour and a half. I would like to begin by doing a land acknowledgement. However, I totally understand that we have participants here from across the country, and land acknowledgement means very different things or very different acknowledgement for different parts of this country. So I'm currently in Scarborough, in Toronto. So I'm going to read out my land acknowledgement, what I believe in. Please take a minute to think about what you would like to acknowledge. So this is how I would start. Uh, the land we are hosting this is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Scarborough is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. In Canada, 48% of First Nation households have difficulty putting enough food on the table. This is due to higher prices for healthy food in remote communities and poverty in urban centers. I would like to take this moment to remember and acknowledge the systemic issues that the indigenous communities and the people of color face in this country even till today. So with that, I'm going to start this discussion. Uh, a few housekeeping points that I would like to mention. Feel free to type in who you are and where you're from in the Zoom chat box. I think that is really exciting to see who we have around this table and to see where you're coming from. If you're experiencing any audio or video issues, please reach out via chat for assistance. Feel free to have your video on or off, whichever you're comfortable with. And the audience will be muted so that speakers can be heard clearly. How much I love just talking to myself right now in front of the screen, but it's fun. If you have questions or comments for our speakers, please put them in the chat box, as this will be monitored, and we'll have time for some audience questions and comments towards the end. This event is being recorded, and you can find the recording on the UBC Wellbeing YouTube channel, and a link will also be embedded on the event webpage. If you would like to remove your name from Zoom, as the event will be published, click on Participants button on the top of the Zoom window. Next, hover your mouse over your name in the participants list on the right side of the Zoom window and click on Rename. So I'm seeing we have people from everywhere. I can see Brampton, Guelph, uh, oh, Pennsylvania. I'm not going to talk about US politics today. We're going to leave that for somebody else to do that. There is some, that's amazing. Pittsburgh, uh, SFU, St. Catharines, Vancouver, of course. Wow, this is really exciting. So without much details, we're going to jump right in this dialogue. This virtual dialogue is the first in the series entitled Promoting Food Security in Higher Education, collaboratively planned by the University of British Columbia, McMaster University, University of Guelph, University of Ottawa, and Meal Exchange. After today's dialogue, the next installment will be in February 2021, with a number of engagement opportunities currently being planned. Through these events, we aim to begin building a network of collaboratively working towards solutions that can be implemented on campuses. Now is the best part. I'm done speaking. Trust me. Now we'll get to the people who we really want to hear from. So we'll start with an introduction to food security within the higher education context. And I'd like to invite the food security in higher education planning team lead and food security project manager at UBC, Sarah Kozicki, to set the scene for us. Sarah, please steal it away.
Hi, thanks Suman for the introduction. And again, thank you so much everyone for joining us today for one of our first dialogues exploring this important topic of food security. And I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm joining you all today as an uninvited guest on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in Vancouver, here in rainy Vancouver. And I look forward to discussing and reflecting further today on concepts of food justice and sovereignty, and recognizing that food insecurity is rooted in systems of colonialism and racism. Now, while there's increasing recognition that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated food insecurity, its presence on our campuses and within our student populations has long been recognized. Research from peer-reviewed and gray literature sources, including Meal Exchange and work here at UBC, has consistently shown between 30 and 40% of students experience some degree of household food insecurity. And currently within the Canadian higher education context, there's a lack of consistent national data. However, there are many emerging opportunities to build comprehensive data sets, especially with the Canadian Campus Wellbeing Survey. Now, students' experiences of household food insecurity range from worrying about having enough money for food, compromising quality of foods consumed. So I always like to think about, say, a friend you had in university surviving purely on ramen noodles, or in most severe situations, skipping meals entirely with severe unintentional weight loss. Household food insecurity is strongly tied to income, and often tuition and housing are fixed costs where food is not. University students face many factors that increase risk for food insecurity that include, but of course not limited to, the rising cost of education, including tuition, textbooks, food and shelter, and inadequate financial assistance. And generally, food insecurity is highest amongst international students, graduate students, transgender and non-binary students, as well as Black, Indigenous, and students of color. And this heightened risk reflects the broad inequities in society, which is often related to discrimination and systemic racism. Here at UBC and across campuses in North America, we're concerned about food insecurity because of the significant impacts on mental, physical, and social well-being. Being food insecure is of particular concern within the university population because of the negative impact it has on learning, academic achievement, and completion of programs, and really work outcomes over time, which ultimately can impact lifelong income, which is ultimately a strong determinant of one's health. Through student-led applied research with the SEEDS sustainability program at UBC, we found that the most common food insecurity intervention in higher education institutions are food banks, and over half of them are student-run. Research has identified that most students are aware of emergency food resources such as food banks, but they're not accessing them out of fear of being recognized and guilt from feeling that they're not needy enough, which really highlights stigma as a major barrier for accessing emergency supports. Clearly, there is much opportunity to provide more holistic supports for food security of our communities as a whole, in addition to exploring and addressing the root causes of household food insecurity. So with all that being said, we want to quickly check in and see what's happening at your institution. So we have a little bit of a poll that's asking about what currently exists on your campus in terms of food security intervention support. So if you can take a moment and fill out that poll, and I'm going to pass it off to Suman again to lead us to the next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a fantastic introduction to the concept. And now actually I have the funnest part of this. I'm going to be the person who's going to ask all the questions, which is always fun to hear everybody. So without much delay, I want to introduce our 4 panelists today. The 4 panelists who's come from very important backgrounds and has some amazing experience to share. So Gurneet, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I can start. Thanks so much, Suman, and thank you all for grounding us. I know we're joining virtually, but it's really important. Think about the land we're on, and especially thinking how closely related that is to the food that we produce. And ends up on our plate for sure. So my name is Gurney Cortami. I am a Punjabi Sikh woman and settler in Canada. I currently study at Mount St. Vincent University, which is located in Mi'kma'ki, which is Mi'kmaq for Nova Scotia, and like to take time to also take time to reflect and provide solidarity with the Mi'kmaq people, and especially thinking about what's happening with the fishery industry, and hope everyone's taking their call to action to really provide support and raise the voices that need to be raised. And yeah, so I go to the Mount, that's our little lingo there, and I'm doing my thesis on diversity in dietetics, looking at the experiences of racialized dietitians. And I guess beyond that, I ground my work in social justice and anti-racism, and am currently working with youth in my own community here in Ontario and York Region with the York Region Food Network. And we're trying to get more youth voices involved in municipal politics.
That's absolutely brilliant. It is so important, the work you're doing, especially as well with the youth in the municipal politics. Next, Paul, do you want to take it over?
And there we go, unmute. Thank you, Suman. And it's great to be here, seeing a few familiar faces. My name is Paul Taylor. I'm the executive director of an organization called Food Share Toronto. And before I do that, I would also like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as the Chippewa peoples. Now, I also want to acknowledge something that I think is often missing in land acknowledgements. Often, when I hear land acknowledgements, I hear references to settlers, I hear references to Indigenous folks, but I don't often hear references or any mention of folks who are here as a result of a legacy of forced migration, the transatlantic slave trade. So I really want to acknowledge all the people who are on this land that are neither settlers nor Indigenous, and who are here, like I say, through forced migration. Now, I work at Food Share. I love the work that I do. I work with an awesome team of people, and Food Share's been around since 1985, 4 years after the first food bank opened in this country, which I think is important for a lot of reasons, and I'll touch on that, I think, a little bit later. But ultimately, the work of Food Share is really to work with communities that have been chronically underinvested in. We're working to build resident or community-led food infrastructure. And you'll hear bits and pieces about our work, but I'm always mindful when I share details on the work that we do, that I acknowledge that food-based programs, food banks, the like, are not going to get to the heart of this issue of food insecurity. So I look forward to talking more about that in the context of rights. So thank you.
Such key points, Paul. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation to hear a lot more. Gwen, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Suman. So I'm Gwen Chapman. I am a white settler woman who's living in Guelph, which is on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people and the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I am currently the Provost and Vice President academic, but I've had a long academic career, which has been broadly based my scholarly interests at the intersection of public health, nutrition, health promotion, and food studies. And so food security, food insecurity, and sustainable food systems have been sort of one of the areas of interest within that. That scholarly work was my main focus for a number of years while I was a faculty member at UBC in the Food, Nutrition, and Health group in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. But 5 years ago, I moved to the University of Guelph to become the Dean of the Social and Applied Human Sciences. Among other things, that college is the home to the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute, or CESI, which has partnered with Meal Exchange on the Student Food Insecurity Survey that was conducted here in 2018. And I'm just getting a catch in my throat, so excuse me for a sec. So this past summer, I moved into the interim provost and vice president academic role. And one of the big questions I always get is, what is a provost anyway? So as provost, I'm responsible for the academic portfolio of the university. So that includes all of our colleges, the academic programs, registrar's office, and student affairs. And I'm also responsible for the operating budget of the university. So moving very much, into academic administration. So, I'm very interested in this topic from my own interests and my own experience as an academic, and bring a number of lenses to it in terms of the various roles that I've had. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
That's awesome. Thanks for joining, Gwen. And last but not least, Kayla.
Hi, everyone. I'll also just kind of start by identifying where I'm currently hosting from, is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa and Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. So this is the area that is the Dish with One Spoon territory, and includes the city of Toronto. I will introduce myself. My name is Kayla Weiler. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the national executive rep for the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario. And so the federation represents 530,000 students across the country at colleges and universities, at the undergraduate and graduate level, as well as domestic and international students. And I'm proud to say that we are Canada's oldest and largest student organization. So we represent over 64 students' unions across the country. And I used to attend the University of Guelph, where I was at the Students' Union there. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks.
That's awesome. Thank you all for the fantastic introductions. So just a reminder to everybody who's joining us in the chat room, if you have any questions, please feel free to write it down there and somebody's monitoring it. If you're comfortable asking the question in French, please do so and we will get it translated and ask the question to the panelist. So now is the fun part, the questions. And when I'm listening to all of you, there is one thing that comes to my mind, and this is something that Meal Exchange has worked on in the past little while. But when you look at research across the number of campuses in the last 5 years, we have seen rates of food insecurity ranging from 20 to 40% of students. Does that surprise you at all? And if so, or if not, why do you think the students are so food insecure? Kayla, do you want to start?
Sure. It's a really great question. And to be honest, I'm not surprised at the number. And that's in itself shocking, is the fact that people are so common and used to this idea that students are food insecure. And I think some of the major reasons of where this comes from is I'm going to highlight tuition fees. The fact that tuition fees across the country are on average over $6,000 for domestic students, let alone 3 to 5 times more for international students, on top of the other expenses that students have to pay, rent, they pay for groceries, and there's not enough financial aid or support. When students apply for national student grants, oftentimes they're given loans that with accumulated interest post their graduation. We also see that the minimum wage across the country is significantly low, yet the cost of tuition has far outpaced the rate of inflation. So we're seeing that students are paying so much more for their education than they ever had before. And there's less public funding to institutions. So it's more, students are paying more for more tuition to fund the system. So it's sad that I'm not shocked, but and it's a sad and staggering number for sure.
You just said how I feel. It's thanks, Kayla. Gwen, do you have anything to add? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's disappointing, certainly, that those figures are so high, because they are higher than, I mean, when we look at food insecurity across the country, those rates are higher than we would like them to be, but the student rates tend to come out higher than they do not for all groups, but for many groups. And I think that it certainly does point to the financial instability that students have. I think there are probably some other factors happening as well in terms of the various transitions that students are going through. It's a life transition, and so there's lots going on for them. So I think that's part of it in terms of perhaps being responsible for food for the first time on their own. And so there are things that they have to learn, which is not to negate the the financial aspects of it, because that is a big part of it. But I think that there are a constellation of things that perhaps come together that that exacerbate that.
That makes a lot of sense, Gwen. Gurmeet, do you have anything to add to this conversation?
Yeah, and I guess like just hearing what Kayla and Gwen have said, it covers a lot of bases for sure. And I'm just thinking about, I know Gwen, you mentioned like that transition period, because when you, I guess for myself coming from an immigrant family household, education is that one thing that can bring you up into mobility to get a better paying job. And it's known like the starving student, right? Like this is the point that you're going to struggle. It's just known, but why does it have to be that way? Why those like 4 pinnacle, whatever years they are, the most important years are going to make or break you, are under so much stress. And we just expect people, if you can make it, you're great. And then you're going places and you can get the job. Otherwise, like it doesn't stop too, by the way, like if you are food insecure, you continue on. And if like the jobs aren't the best, the income, and thinking about COVID too, right? There's a lot of factors like that kind of add on to that. And then you become still food insecure, but you're also working. So then you're like the working poor, and it kind of leads into a lot of other things. So I think when we just focus into like the student, you're like, it's only going to be when you're a student. It does continue on. And if you look at the rates nationally in Canada, it's like 1 in 8 households. And I think it's even almost like 1 in 7, according to like Stats Canada right now with COVID. Like it continues on.
You're so correct. Paul, does this surprise you at all, these numbers?
It doesn't surprise me, and like the panelists before me, I'm also disappointed, but I'm going to approach this a little bit differently, I think, as to why this happens. I think why this happens is because of all of us. We have allowed this idea of the struggling student to go kind of, or the starving student, as Gurneet said, unchecked. You know, these are, and I think what this speaks to is a bit of a middle-class bias that permeates many of our institutions and systems, including education. You know, we think as a society that it's okay for someone to temporarily struggle while they're in university because we imagine that they have all kinds of family supports around them and the like. But I think this is one of the things that we fundamentally have to chip away at, especially if we want to advance, if we want to seize opportunities for education to actually be the great equalizer that it may have the potential to be. And I think one of the ways to do that, the types of conversations that I think we should be having in this country, one of the richest countries in the world, is why isn't tuition free already? It's outrageous. You know, and there's so many more things I could talk about, but I think one of the things we've got to be talking about is why isn't our government making sure that they're advancing that and creating the types of systems that allow people, including students, including Indigenous communities, including the residents of Nunavut, to access food. Like we have a right to food in this country, and we've had a right to food since 1976. Anything other than all of us having the food that we need is a failure of government.
Absolutely. And this brings us to my next question, which flows right through. And I'm going to start with you, Paul, if you don't mind. Student food insecurity is an issue that we have seen, it's hiding in plain sight. It is the starving student, the temporarily living on ramen, has a long romantic story behind it. Do you think we need to really dismantle the stereotypes about food insecurity?
Without a doubt, without a doubt. And I think we also need to look at the intersecting identities that folks have. They're not just students. They might be lone parents. They might be Black. And we know that folks who are Black in Canada are 3.5 times more likely to live in a food insecure household. So we absolutely need to disavow ourselves of the acceptability of these types of notions because no one in this country should lack access to food. As I said before, the federal government it was introduced in 1966 and ratified in 1976. Every single one of us has a right to food, you know, and this pandemic, you know, we've gone from about 4.4 million people that are food insecure to 5.5 million people. Again, that is unacceptable. And I feel like we need to be writing to our members of parliament, our members of provincial parliament, to make sure that things like the right to food is not just something that we say and that you know, our governments sign on to, but actually there are policies embedded in our domestic legislation that actually allow us to advance things like the right to food.
Amazing. Gurneet, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, and I guess just with what Paul mentioned with government and policy, yeah, when you really think about it, and I guess this goes back to like when we even did our land acknowledgements, understanding the relationship with the land and the people and also the food we grow. But who gets the bigger piece of the pie and who doesn't? And why do we still have boil water advisories when it's 2020? Like, it's just a lot of shortcomings from the government for sure. And we shouldn't be facing this at this point, definitely in our lives and with COVID and everything else going on. Like, I think COVID has been a great example to bring up a lot of the inequities that were always there, but it's now really in front of you, and we can't like plead to ignorance or anything like that. Like, it needs to be addressed. If someone's coming to class and is late to class and is hungry and is juggling a lot of jobs and their performance isn't the best in the period when they are in university or college, like, we need to think about that, not just have these stereotypes and be like, this is a lazy student, or this student, maybe this is not cracked up to what it should, like, it's not cracked up to what I'm expecting from them. So we really need to look beyond just what we see and dig deeper into going into these critical discussions, which oftentimes we don't really get a chance to do.
Absolutely. Kayla or Gwen, do you have anything to add to this conversation?
Sure. Yeah. Something I totally agree with the points that were already made, and I'm so glad that we're already having this conversation about free education during this panel. That's something that students have been calling for decades, is more public funding so that we can reduce and eliminate tuition fees for all. It's definitely not the catch-all solution to food insecurity, but it definitely has a major impact on students. And something I also wanted to add is that I think, like, also with food insecurity, is there's a lot of shame associated with it. There's a lot of shame of feeling embarrassed for accessing a food bank. And just even thinking from my own experience of like, my family had access to food bank when I was a child, and yet still to this day, 10 years later, my family and I, we've never talked about it. We've never identified the fact that was a point in our life, and having to access a food bank or other food supports. There's also this, conversation about the kind of food that people can access on campus, and the fact that, what is considered affordable is maybe not healthy. So a lot of students will resort to cheaper foods because that's simply what they can afford. And it's kind of this assumption that, as a student, you have to be in debt, or you have to just put up with the fact that food is expensive and not accessible. When let's challenge that. Let's challenge this idea that we have to, as students, accept the bare minimum or accept low standards, when we can call for better. We can call for more affordable but also healthy food on our campuses and in our communities.
And maybe just to pick up particularly on that last point that Kayla made around the stereotypes, and I think this goes back to one of the comments Sarah made in discussing the findings of our survey, which is that even students who are experiencing food insecurity are maybe not accessing the food banks, partly because of the shame, but also because of this stereotype that sort of as a student, you're expected to be struggling or you're expected to be hungry. And so I think that is part of the stereotype. It's not just that there is sort of an internalized almost expectation sometimes around that. And so we have to get the word out there that no, you shouldn't be worried about where your next meal is going to be coming from just because you're a student. And so that's something I think that needs to be addressed as well.
Yes, Gwen, you're just speaking my language. So do you think, and I'm going to just bring this up very quickly, and I'm going to leave it to anybody who wants to answer this in the interest of time. Do you think student food insecurity has anything to do with income? And does anybody want to talk about that side of it for a couple of minutes?
Well, I mean, I think I would just start by saying I think food insecurity almost always in Canada has something to do with income, because and I guess it's the balance between income and expenses, and because we know there's unless you're in, you know, a remote community that perhaps has difficulty in getting good food in, our universities are generally in cities where there is plenty of food if you can afford to buy it. Now, there may be some transportation problems if you're, you know, living on campus and it's hard to get to the grocery stores, but, you know, I think those are probably less in most cases than the income issues. So absolutely, I think, because if people had adequate income, then, you know, they would, in relation to their expenses. And I know, you know, tuition has certainly been talked about. That is a major expense for students. Housing is also incredibly expensive in many Canadian locations now. Food may be expensive. The food that's available in the stores that are easy for students to access may be expensive. So, you know, there are multiple, if you look at it from a sort of systemic point of view, there are multiple components, I guess, in that student budget. There's the income and the various aspects of expenses. And if they're not matching, you know, I think food is often seen as the easy thing to give, because your rent, for example, it may be huge, but you have to pay it. And, you know, you can think, okay, maybe I can go for a day or two without food, but the rent is due. So I think that you have to look at all of those things together.
Absolutely. So, sorry, yes, Paul, please.
I just want to add one other thing. And first of all, you know, I love that the food, you know, folks connected to food work, it's taken a long time, I think, for people to really anchor the conversation and one about rights and income. But I think we also, there's more to the conversation. It's anti-Black racism, it's anti-indigeneity. You know, these are systemic and structural things that actually have an impact on how much income people have. So I worry that when we only focus on income, we ignore the conversation about racism. You know, I mentioned earlier, if you're Black, you're 3.5 times more likely to live in a low-income household. But there are a whole host that, you know, we did some research on this with Proof that I encourage folks to take a look at. We've got an infographic on our website. But one of the things we're realizing is food insecurity, interventions around food insecurity, income, absolutely, but also we've got to be talking about tackling anti-Black racism, we've got to be talking about tackling anti-indigeneity, and we've got to be talking about access to country foods and all kinds of things above and beyond income.
Great points, Paul. Thank you for bringing that up. So I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. I'm going to pick up from where Gurmeet spoke. COVID-19, of course, has impacted every aspect of our lives. Gurneet, how has it impacted students?
Yeah, and I guess that's a very loaded question. I'm just thinking about misgraduation, thinking about the job you had lined up for summer, thinking about, yeah, even just going to university or college for the first year. Like, just everything has been disrupted. So it's kind of like when you watch a movie, you're just like, this is what it's going to be like. And it's like, no, it's a little bit delayed there. So there definitely has been a lot of disruption, what I see online and hear from other students. And I guess even for myself, like in March when everything went down and I came back to Ontario, and I was fortunate enough to have social support and financial support to, you know, just literally vacate my place and come over and fly over and things like that and be home with my family. So I consider myself to be privileged and to have access to food. And that's not something that always comes on my mind. But when it comes to the advocacy and giving support back, it's a lot of I know Paul brought up the income aspect, but like I think even for my work, it's looking at anti-racism. That's been a huge conversation that's been happening. We need to tackle racism because racism is in the food system. And there's been a lot of discussions. I particularly think about the international students. I remember we have a lot of international students in Halifax, particularly Nova Scotia. Like you don't have access to usually like your cultural foods. Now university is shut off. And what about your visa? So there's a lot of displacement and a lot of chaos. And I feel like a lot of people have been left to just figure it out for themselves. And if you're privileged and have the resources, great. And if you're not, it's been a lot of, writing to people. And I remember for my rent too, I had to like write and I'm like, I don't know if I have to pay my rent. I'm here. I need to find someone to sublet. That was such a chaotic thing too. And I had to pay extra rent and I wasn't even there. So it's a lot of those like you didn't think that was going to happen, but it happened. But I think the government and everyone, you can't ignore that this is a huge issue, and we need to focus more on how do we provide anti-racist education and support in these systems, but also thinking about income, and these intersections are not in silos anymore. Like everything's interrelated, and it's hard to, we got to put the puzzle together. We can't just play with the pieces by itself.
Totally get it. So, Paul, how has COVID affected a food organization like yours and the folks you serve?
I think actually even more broadly, when I think about kind of food work, I think one of the things the pandemic has done, to pick up on what Gurneet said, and Gurneet mentioned this earlier, I think has really exposed, again, some of the racism that we've allowed to exist through legislation and policy. So the pandemic has really shone a light on, for example, migrant agricultural workers who, I live in the province of Ontario. You know, these are folks that are typically Black and brown, working on farms in Ontario and across the country. But in Ontario, we have a premier who said to migrant agricultural workers, even if you're positive, or if you have symptoms, you know, still go to work. You know, so it really just tells me how much we value Black and brown low-wage workers in our food system. So I think it's highlighted that the issue of migrant agricultural workers and the ways in which the system penalizes them for having darker skin. I also think, you know, I have a real fear about this pandemic, and it's not just contracting the virus. You know, it goes back to, I think it's important to set the context. So, you know, before the 80s, when there were issues of you know, people not having enough money for food, you know, governments stepped in really meaningful ways and looked at income-based interventions. You know, it was when Thatcher and Mulroney and Reagan were in power, completely took us on another path, you know, the proliferation of the neoliberal agenda. And what we've seen as a result of that is the explosion of charity, the explosion of food charity. You know, food banking since 1981 has really just exploded, and we've constructed that as our default response to these quite wicked problems. So I worry, much like what happened in 2008, I worry now that we're seeing all of these mutual aid networks, and I think it's really great to see some of that stuff pop up, and to some extent because people are wanting to do something to help people in a difficult situation. But I worry that we're going to further enshrine these types of responses and direct students and others to these types of supports that ultimately don't address the root causes of the issue. So lastly, when I think about, you know, this proliferation of food banks and mutual aid, ultimately I was reflecting on it last night. And I think ultimately what it is people have given up on government. People have given up on government to be able to use the levers available to them to tackle issues like this. So people are trying to do whatever they can, but I would encourage people not to give up on government and continue to hold them accountable for the things that they agreed to do.
Very well put. Gwen, let me ask you this question. So COVID has obviously impacted universities as well. We all know that. So what are the major trends, priorities, pressures within the higher education at the moment? And where are the barriers and opportunities to advance food security as a priority on campus?
Well, I mean, the pandemic has changed everything for everybody, I think. But, you know, certainly if you look on campuses, most campuses, including the University of Guelph, have gone predominantly to remote online education. So our faculty have had to learn very quickly how to and figure out how to take their courses and put them online. Students are studying from home. You know, we don't have a lot of activity on our campuses. So there is certainly some research still going on, but we don't have the campus-based life that we're used to. Certainly, you know, in terms of our time and attention, there is so much focus just on figuring out, okay, how do we get through this? How do we transition to doing our core work of delivering the best academic content we can for our students? And so, you know, I think one of the barriers is bandwidth. And, you know, just as students are struggling to figure out how to work over their computer from home, we have faculty and staff who are also working from home, juggling with childcare, perhaps working in less than ideal situations, inadequate internet capabilities and so on. So all of that just takes so much of our time and attention that there's not much left over. I think the other issue, though, is that even the surveys that we have about campus food insecurity, it's campus food insecurity. It's our students who are on campus, and the things that are causing food insecurity and the strategies that we have to address it are probably completely different in this environment. Some students are living at home. That may increase food insecurity. It may decrease food insecurity. Or there are fewer students living in residence. And the Guelph survey suggested that students who have a meal plan are slightly less food insecure than students who don't. Well, we don't have students on meal plans right now, hardly any. I mean, there are a few students in residence, but it's 10% or so in our case of what it normally is. So there's so much we don't know about what the issues are right now, and we don't have bandwidth to deal with them. And the strategies that we would usually use are not, a food bank on campus which is not the ideal solution. I completely agree with that. So I think those are some of the dangers or the barriers. But I think, maybe in terms of the opportunities, it does give us an opportunity to rethink what are the issues here, and to ask some of those questions. And so how do we, other than providing emergency or ensuring that there is some emergency food relief to students, what are some of the other strategies that we can use? So not a lot of answers there, but a lot of constraints, I guess.
No, I think that's great, Gwen. Kayla, do you have anything to add to this?
Sure. And it's I find it's just really interesting that my experience at the University of Guelph kind of mirrors Gwen's comments there as well. And I think some things that I also want to touch on is the fact that currently during COVID-19, the priorities here are health and safety. It's like, first and foremost, it's like, let's make sure that students and workers on campus have access to proper education when it comes to health and safety and personal protective equipment. And so that brings a lot of challenges when it comes to students operating food banks on their campuses or other food services, because those health and safety puts up a lot of barriers. I think of the Guelph Student Food Bank, which is run by the Students' Union, is one of the oldest buildings on campus. It's very old, and there's decent proper hand washing in the building, but also it's such a small building that for people to come by during the COVID-19 pandemic to pick up items it's just not COVID-19 safe. I also want to talk about how this is also, the pandemic is coming after a year in the province of Ontario that there was major cuts to education. Universities are still feeling the effects of the 2019 cuts to education from the Ontario government, but we're also heading into a period where the government is trying to put forward performance-based funding, which will ultimately continue to defund education. And one other Ontario-specific situation was the Student Choice Initiative, which was this policy put forward by the government to defund food banks, to defund students' unions, to defund the student groups on campus that students had already voted for, that they wanted. Students already had referendums that said, yes, we want to fund a food bank on our campus. So we're seeing that there's attacks, and not just from the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're seeing that our education system had already been so underfunded, but also there was a direct attack amongst the students groups that are trying to address the major issues, including food insecurity on our campuses.
So just a follow up to that, Kayla, why and how, according to you, why and how are universities responsible for the well-being of students?
Yeah, so I had to think about this a little bit because I think I wanted to kind of talk about, in the largest grand scheme of things, education is a right, and it's not even up for debate. Access to education should be available to anyone who wants to access it. But I think another aspect of it is that our college and university campuses you know, they market themselves as a community, but also this is more than just buzzwords. Students do find communities within their college and university campus, and they develop support systems to help them get through the world of academia because it is challenging. And for students who are from different backgrounds like this, the institutions that we are attending are colonial and racist. So for BIPOC students, like these are communities that they find on campus. And I also think that overall post-secondary education should never be this elitist system and elitist institution that no one can access. So it's not only just that education is a right, but we also have a duty to future generations to create a system that is accessible to all, but also taking on the challenges of food insecurity, the challenges of lack of public funding. And when it comes to the conversation with the, you know, students and the administration is because currently we are collecting tuition fees and mainly tuition fees from international students, there is a responsibility to collect that money and to enact it in a fiduciary responsibility. This is hard-earned money from students to pay for their education. So let's have conversations about how is this money going directly into the classroom, and how is this money going to directly impact and benefit students, whether it's through different services on campus, better supports for faculty, because let's be honest, there's so many faculty who are also food insecure because they don't have full contracts and full benefits or high or decent wages. There's other workers on campus who work in food service who are also food insecure. So it's a responsibility to be financially responsible with our tuition fees, but also respectful of the communities that our campuses currently have and the communities that are built so that people can get through the institutions that were just simply not built for them in the first place.
Very well spoken, Kayla. Gwen, from your perspective on the administration side, anything to add on to this?
Well, just that, you know, I think that student well-being is a broad responsibility. Universities have responsibility for student well-being, just as sort of society, government, and so on. It's not the responsibility of any one group or one organization, but, you know, the students, the universities exist to a great extent for the education and, you know, overall well-being of our students, and especially for, you know, students who may be away from home for the first time, students who are living in residence. The university is sort of their home as well as where they are learning. And we also know students won't learn well if they are not well. And I think one of the other things I could have mentioned even in answering my earlier question is that we know that mental health is a huge issue for students. Right now, I think it's an issue for faculty and staff as well, but we've known for a number of years that there are issues around student mental health. And so, you know, universities have certainly been trying to step up and figure out how can we support students' overall well-being, whether it's their physical health, their mental health, their nutritional health, and so on.
So I'm not going to put you on spot, but one thing that I worked in the campus food system for the last 18 years from an operation side of it. And what I never figured out ever is why is food ancillary to a campus? Why is it not essential?
Well, that's a good question. And I mean, partly that sort of probably technical, even in relation. I mean, I described my role earlier as responsible for the academic portfolio. So I'm responsible for that, which is sort of that core mission of the campus. I'm not responsible for the food service. I'm not responsible for parking and so on. And so in that way, they are ancillary, I guess, to the campus mission. Which is not to say that there aren't intersections and that we don't have, you know, conversations between those. And so, you know, I think that the campus food service is seen as part of supporting that student well-being. Not only nutritional health, but, you know, the cultural, the gathering of students, the sort of enjoyment aspects of their lives, and so on. So, you know, so foods are recognized as part of that core, just as, you know, student housing, providing a good living experience to students, providing athletics so that they can be, you know, physically engaged, and so on. they are an important part of campus life, and nobody's denying that. But that term ancillary does get used for sort of separating out roles and responsibilities, I think.
Sorry, did not want to put you on spot, Gwen.
No, that's
This is a
good.
burning question I had, and it was my frustration that I totally feel that it's so important we all understand the relationship of food with education.
And I think that maybe I'd add one more point, and I don't know what university you worked at, but the two universities I worked at, Guelph and UBC, both have, they have their own food service through the university. They haven't contracted out to catering companies and so on. And I think that has allowed for, so I can't speak for that other context, but in those situations, it has allowed for some enrichment between the academic and the food service side of things, whether it's providing placements for students. I mean, certainly at UBC, I was involved in the Think and Eat Green at School program, which really involved student practicum placements within the UBC food service, also combining with the public schools sector. At Guelph, again, we have students who are working in our food service, doing education, doing their practicum placements, and thinking about how the food that is served relates to student well-being on multiple levels. So some of that is happening in some of those cases anyway.
Gwen, you're talking about two gold standards here. Both the campuses are.
I kind of guessed that.
So Gurneet, my next question is to you. The majority of campus food banks are run by student organizations, and students have often been at the forefront of emergency food provision. What role and responsibility do students have for ensuring the well-being of their peers? What do you think?
Yeah, and I guess like when you mentioned that, I'm thinking back to what I've seen at Mount Stephenson University, and I also went to Ryerson for my undergrad, so I'm thinking back to that too. There's a lot of pressure again on students. It's great when you are able to see someone like a classmate and have that support to talk about, like, food really does bring people together. Just, I guess, me being in nutrition and dietetics, like that's the one thing that brings everyone together. So being able to see someone that looks like you, understands, and can support you, that's there for sure. I think the struggle kind of comes, we had this at the Mount, we had a problem, like the food bank would be at odd hours. People that I remember used to go to like an event in the same area. So people would always keep coming, but they wouldn't come to the event that I'm at. They were always like, is the food bank open? And like you would at least, I saw like 10 people usually at a time. And it was unfortunate that it was always closed. So like the hours weren't always operating. They did send out an email following up like later on, like there's a lack of volunteers, but then it just goes back to like the bigger question, why is this in the first place? Like, what does that say about food access even on campus? Is it affordable? Is it what people are looking for? I remember even my friend brought this up too. So is food halal or kosher? And depend, like it's not an issue I had back here in Ontario, but like going to Nova Scotia, like it's there, and it's a lot of international students coming in. So that was like a question, and it was taken and things like that, but nothing really came out of it. So if you're not getting food that's affordable, accessible, and what you want to eat, and also going off campus, that's another story on its own. Remember those bus rides? Yeah, another story on its own. So like, what do you have access to? And like the other resource is always closed or it's not always operating. So it just leaves you going back to your dorm, being a little bit sad and hungry, and then maybe ordering a pizza, but that might be overpriced too. So there's a lot of those struggles, and it's unfortunate that people are at university and are supposed to be here to study and go places, but then you're hungry and you're alone, and all the isolation is really, it's there. And it's something we do need to talk more of and discuss.
Absolutely. Before I ask my next question, I really want to encourage everybody, if you're not following the chat, please do. There are some amazing conversations happening around there. So please do follow the chat from everybody. My next question is for Paul. Paul, this seems to be the year of reckoning and awakening for many around systemic injustices that persists and which disproportionately impact Black and Indigenous folks in particular. Paul, you have partnered on research that shows that Black Canadians are 3 times more likely to experience food insecurity than white Canadians. And research on campuses hint at similar experiences for racialized students. How should this shape our response to student food insecurity? And where do you see the biggest opportunity to advance these conversations in higher education?
Oh, that is a meaty question. I will try
Yes.
my best. Um, so I guess you will hear me say over and over again the same thing. So I will talk about, I'm going to start my response with the right to food. It wasn't a bunch of students that got together and said, you know what, I think we should have the right to food in Canada. It wasn't a bunch of universities and colleges that got together and said, hey, you know what, we should have the right to food in Canada. It was our government. And so when I talk about public policies to challenge food insecurity for students and everyone, I see that responsibility resting with government. So what are some of the things that are at their disposal to tackle food insecurity? Well, I think in one of the richest countries in the world, we should we should be advancing a conversation around human rights. So I think that needs to be the framework. I think a lot of folks have kind of jumped on one policy or jumped on another policy, but I always struggle with that because I don't think we can look at a policy on its own. So for example, if we were to look at something like a basic income on its own, but yet the federal government continued not to build affordable housing, or childcare costs continue to go up, transit remained inaccessible. So I think we need to have a conversation about advancing human rights and the framework that allows us to do that, and looking at the tools available to every single level of government to advance our human rights. So then I think we would come to something like an income floor or a basic income to ensure that everyone has at least a basic income. But also, I think we also need to be having a conversation about a public services guarantee as part of that framework. So if we have a basic income, we also need to say, well, a big cost for folks is housing. So we need to, in the 90s, we used to build significant amounts of affordable housing, a combination of rental, co-ops, and social housing. We need to be doing more of that. We need to, introduce a childcare program. We need pharmacare. All of those things together, I think, help advance a human rights conversation. So those are some of the things I think we need to do. And it needs to be focused on a good quality of life that protects our human rights. We should all be able to expect a decent quality of life in one of the richest countries in the world.
Great point, Paul. Gwen, do you have anything to add from your perspective?
Not a lot, because I really, agree with a lot of what Paul is saying, and what I appreciate among many things is sort of that very high view, and recognizing that this sort of starts with government, and maybe I think we're in difficult times in relation to government, and many of us may have, clear views on what we want government to be doing and the approach that we want government be taking. But certainly in the United States, as we have just seen, but I think in Canada as well, when we see what happens in provincial elections, for example, that there are many people who are supporting other agendas. And so I think that's the challenge, is how do we get through to government around the importance of the basic human rights, around income, around, rights to food, right to education, and so on, because it's there are other voices out there.
Thank you very much, Gwen, for that. Really appreciate that. So the next question that I have, I'm going to start with Paul first on this again. So we see folks trying to address food insecurity across Canada on campuses and in community. What are the most promising practices you see for addressing food insecurity, and where should we be putting our energy right now? Paul?
I'm going to say, in the interest of time, the same answer that I just gave, but I'll use the time to say something else that I've just been thinking about as I listen to everyone. I've heard folks mention the right to education. There is a right to education as much as there's a right to food, but I think we don't have political commitment, real commitments around these things. So I think what we could be doing is letting our elected officials know that our right to housing, our right to food, our right to education, the rights of Indigenous peoples, that those rights are really important to us, and that we want to see governments doing everything they can to protect them. Because right now, I feel like it's something that they say, we have a right to this and a right to that, but we don't. if they don't do the work and implement it in our domestic legislation.
Makes all the sense. Gurneet, did you have anything to add to this?
I guess similar to Paul's point, I guess it's that political will. It shouldn't just be like waiting for the next election, whether it's municipal, federal, provincial. It's, yeah, like a lot of students have been, well, I know with Meal Exchange, there was something going on in March to like go to our president and talk about like investing into the food system. And you know what, like, if you really think about it, the power is in our hands. We are the ones that vote everyone in. And why don't we have a right to like knock on someone's door? I remember going so much to my MPP here in Ontario, in Vaughan, Woodbridge, and being like, OSAP loans. Why is this happening? Constant conversation, end up being the same thing. But you know what, like it gets planted there, and then, you know, they're thinking about it, and then they go and talk to their other MPPs or MPs, and they're like, everyone's talking about this, like maybe we should do something. So it really goes back to like, we do have the power in our hands. It's up to us to really, you know, pressure the government, also pressuring our universities and colleges and being like, so what's going to change? I don't like, now we're thinking about building back better. Let's build back better. I don't want to go back to same like cafeteria where I know after like week 3, it's all going to be on rewind and it's not going to be any different, or it's not culturally inclusive. It doesn't represent the food that I eat at home or what my mom makes. So it's a time to really change things up, and we have a huge voice, and it's really important to not feel like they never heard us before. What makes anything now different? It does make a difference, and it's just about going and doing it, and it's can't be ignored anymore, that's for sure.
That totally makes sense. But either Paul or Gurmeet, do you think food hubs have any space in campuses? It's a popular model right now. Either Paul or Gurmeet, anybody has any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking even at our university, like having something student-led or that support, I think it's a great way to like we really need the opportunity to co-design with like faculty about with food services. Youth, like student voices need to be there all time, not just like, this is what we're going to do and we're going to get this food hub and we're going to do this type of stuff. We need to have that consistently, not like a one-off consultation on like a Friday where we all know no one's really on campus. We need to have that investment and that ongoing that co-design ability, because I don't see it. Even consultations, very one-off. It's like we have to do it, and it just a checkbox. So if we don't really involve students from the beginning and we're just there for an evaluation, that makes no sense.
Absolutely. Paul, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just, you know, food hubs are lovely, you know, I have nothing against food hubs. But I think, you know, the intention behind a food hub is to connect connect producers and consumers a little bit. Doesn't matter how closely connected you are if you can't afford to buy the food. And again, you know, as has been mentioned, I think the number one issue around this stuff is food insecurity, it's income, it's racism, it's anti-indigeneity. I don't think any of those things are necessarily tackled by a food hub, although they could be, but it's a model that I've yet to see.
Great. Kayla, do you have any insight on this, working with Students' Union across? Do you think there is any success stories of a food hub anywhere? And is there something you can share?
Yeah, I'm familiar in particular with the University of Guelph as well as the University of Toronto, and CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. They have a campaign called Dine In for Better Jobs. And it's talking about how the fact that the food that's on our campuses, it can be something that comes locally, but also this is a service that can have decent jobs. And when we're talking about like wages, oftentimes people do work in food service, whether they're students or they work full time in food service on campus. The interesting thing about this campaign is talking about bringing the food services back in-house. There are companies, external companies that are for profit that have some of the worst labor practices, as well as some of the worst food practices that have these contracts on our campuses. to just, kind of talk about the University of Guelph, for example, the food service is a department within the university, meaning that their university has control over what kind of food is offered to students, but also students are able to sit on committees and give their legitimate feedback about what is working for food on campus and what's not working. And also, I think it's good to talk about the fact that many people who do work in food service are working part-time, or they're working split shifts, and they don't have the proper representation, and they also don't have paid sick days. And that's not just an Ontario issue, that's across Canada, that's an issue. So having decent jobs, decent unionized jobs, as well as like in-house food services is a way to have these improvements to our food structures on campus, but also can help decrease the cost, but increase the quality. So I think it's a really exciting to think about what can the future of on-campus food look like. And I think there's already a couple really good examples, and there's a lot of really good examples from students' unions that run their own cafeterias, as well as like coffee shops of like what works and what's applicable to students, but also other folks who are on campuses as well too.
Great points. And as much as I know quite a few students' union doing a great job on campuses, but I share Paul's frustration, and I think everybody around, that's not the job of the students. And I think that is something that we need to keep in our mind. I'm really glad students are doing it, all powers, but it's just a conversation more to happen. So Gwen, my next question is for you. So we know that food insecurity is intimately tied to income, and we often look to the provincial and federal governments to raise incomes, whether through benefits, student loans, minimum wages, etc. What can universities do to raise students' incomes?
Well, I think that first of all, we still do look to the provincial and federal governments to, regulate and influence these things. But universities do lobby governments, and so we have our government relations staff who are regularly communicating with various ministries. And so I think continuing to lobby and to talk about the need for adequate student financial aid, for the financial issues facing students, minimum wage, and so on. So I think that is a role universities do play and can continue to play. Within the constraints that the universities have, continuing to provide bursaries to students, excuse me, fundraising so that we do have emergency financial support for students, so that we have strong scholarship programs. Employing students, universities do a lot of employing students, whether it's through co-op students, whether it's in residences, in libraries, and in food service as well. And so and I know certainly over the last number of months with COVID, we have been actively looking at how we can keep employing students as much as we can in this context, and providing emergency funding to them as well. So those are sort of the main ones that come to mind for me. But again, I think, emphasizing that it's not just a university issue or responsibility. And so part of it is for us to be a voice in those larger conversations about the importance of maintaining student incomes and finding ways to support that.
Awesome. Kayla, do you have anything to add to that point?
Yeah, I just have a couple things. I think something that when we're talking about lobbying, oftentimes we do this kind of work in silos where students through the Federation, we will lobby the provincial and federal governments, but we know that we're stronger when we have workers or administration on our side and lobbying with us. And I think like that's a really unique point or interesting point that we should continue to talk about, is how can we have a united front when we go toward the government to talk about the lack of public funding for institutions and the reason why education is so expensive. I also think that institutions can play a role in taking more of the costs, such as athletic center fees, co-op fees, and career services fees. These have typically been ancillary fees that students pay on campus that are run by the administration. So I think like that's something that can definitely help and curb the high cost of tuition fees. But also another thing is for graduate students, having more and better in-kind support, because graduate students are paying tuition, especially even during this pandemic. Graduate students, among all students, are paying tuition that have been increased for many students, but they're also workers on campus, and sometimes there's a lot of graduate students who they don't receive enough funding and a large enough funding package that they actually equate to making less than minimum wage. So let's talk about having better supports for graduate students, as well as more grants as offered to all students, whether college or undergraduate, and especially international students. I think that's another thing that is we must not forget, is that international students definitely have the bulk of the pressures and stress of paying such high tuition fees.
Awesome. I've got a list of a few more questions, but before I get to them, just in the interest of time, I really want to get to a couple of questions from the audience, because I think there are some very valid questions out there, and I would love to have this conversation going that direction a little bit. So one of the questions is, curious what the panelists think about addressing the tension between food affordability and supporting sustainable, just food. Gurneet, do you have anything to say on that?
Like that's like the hottest topic ever. I want something to be sustainable, and I want to know where it comes from, but at the same time want to be able to afford it. Yeah, I think when I think about that, it comes back to, it brings a lot of factors in. So you're thinking about income, also respecting the time and how the food was procured, and thinking about migrant workers. So it really brings up the whole food system, from like literally the farm to the plate and the government and everything in between. I think that's something, like, honestly, there's a lot of these things that we can definitely go into, but I think the main thing that we always need to be present is with anti-racism. Like, racism is there in the food system, and I don't think we talk about it. I know Paul always brings it up too, and it's great, but it shouldn't always be on the burden of racialized people, because we're doing all this other stuff, and then we don't get to do the actual stuff we want to do because we're still trying to talk about racism. And it's there. And I think before we can really get into like the nitty-gritty of everything, like, that needs to be addressed. And we really need to think about, what does it mean to be a migrant worker? How are they paid well or not paid well? What is the government doing? Me going in and wanting this like cool, like sustainably sourced meal and everything, it cost $15. But like, I remember I was a lab TA for chemistry at the Mount. I used to make 11 something an hour. And I'm just like, I'm a grad student. Why am I making 11 something? And the minimum wage is actually pretty low. It just went up to like 12, right under $13, I would say, in Nova Scotia. So really low, unless you're like there's other funding, like I know Kayla brought up, like, yeah, it's low. So, and then being racialized and all that other connection to food. I think we really need to talk about the stuff before we get to the food, which goes back to the systems in place, whether it's inclusive or not. The racism aspect of it. And before we can really even get to the food, there's a lot of business before that. And that's what needs to be addressed, I would say. And it's difficult. Like, even for me, I'm trying to even grapple in my own thesis. It's difficult, but we need everyone to be at the table and bring their perspectives and have that difficult and uncomfortable conversation of, why are these inequities in place? Who does it benefit and who doesn't? And who's willing, it's not giving up things, it's distributing the power and equity. How do we put equity back in and make the pie full for everyone?
Well said, Gurneet. Well said. Next question. Do you think there needs to be a conversation on health or food literacy when we are talking about food insecurity? So let me ask Gwen. Gwen, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I think, particularly at the university level, I think food literacy is an issue. And, I go to the example of my own child who, went off to university, and despite my best intentions as a parent to raise a food literate child, I would, for the first couple of years, I would get texts from the grocery store like, what should I buy if I want to make such and such? And then once my child was home, I'd get texts, what am I going to do with this? And so, I think that's part of the transition that I was talking about earlier, that when people are on their own for the first time in their lives, perhaps, that there are some issues, and it brought home for me, it's not just cooking skills, it's grocery shopping skills, it's food inventory management, it's menu planning, and so on. So I think particularly for university students, there is some of that happening, but I don't want people to think that that's the main thing, because that may be fairly widespread amongst students who can afford to go to the grocery store, like my child, and buy the food they want, and so that's an issue, but it's not the dominant issue. So yes, food literacy is an issue, but don't let that take over from the sort of income issues.
Absolutely fair. Paul, the next question, I think I'm going to start with you on that one. How do we tackle neoliberal policies in tangible ways, especially concerning food?
Oh, I'm thinking about the last question, thinking about this current question. Where do I begin? Can I just, I'm sorry to do this, but I just want to jump back for a moment.
Absolutely.
I think this is a really important piece. You asked a question about food insecurity, and one of the things I realized the more time I spend doing this work is we actually, I feel like we don't understand the term. And I see so many projects, I've been on grant review committees and the like, where anything to do with food, we call it food security or food insecurity, challenging food insecurity. But we have to be really clear that, as Gwen said earlier, the most important thing that has an impact on food insecurity is people's income. It's an income issue. So sure, cooking classes are great, but to be quite frank, I've been poor longer than I've not been poor in my life. And in university, I would not have wanted to have gone to a cooking class. I cooked quite well. And who was teaching that cooking class? Was it someone that looked like me? Was it someone that knows what type of food I have access to at home? So I think we have to separate those conversations. Food literacy is important work, but it's not tackling food insecurity. And I worry that, like food banks, it clouds our perception of this issue and just allows us to not actually do what we need to do, which is say, minimum wage is going to have more of an impact. Increasing minimum wage going up from Ontario when it was supposed to go from 14 to 15, that is going to have much more impact on food insecurity than handing out three-legged carrots, than handing out leftover food or corporate waste or cooking classes. So I just had to get that out of my head. Sorry, and maybe I won't answer the question because I've said a lot already.
No, I would still love to hear your opinion on the question I asked you.
How do we tackle neoliberal policies? We don't elect neoliberal politicians. I think that's all there is to it, simply put. I think I really liked what Gurneet was saying earlier. Like, we have to, I think sometimes what we think is the way to influence policy, if we're not connected to a large institution, is to vote once every years. That's just one of the things, I think some of us that have the time, the privilege, what have you, we could be out and we could be calling our MP every day. We could be having conversations around the dinner table in our community. If our MP isn't willing to advance progressive policies, we should be talking to folks in our neighborhood. We should be saying, this is a politician, this is a political party that's not willing to advance my human rights.
Makes so much sense. This question is, I'm going to see who wants to answer this. In what ways can campus farms serve as a dignified food resource for students on campus? Gurneet, do you have any insights on this?
Money in the hands of students, that's so rare sometimes to have control over it. So when I think about that and like the dignity behind it, and I just want to say, like, when you think about all the students coming to the campus, these are like really bright students. These are really people that bring a lot of hope and dreams, and it's having the space and, you know, like the first interaction, you like, again, like even for myself, like maybe being the first person to go to university per se here in Canada for my family. So even that, like the first experience you have, and like if it's not the best, and there's a lot of things that come into mind where like, is it because of race, is it because of this? And at the initial point, like if you don't feel included, there's a feeling that always sits with you with those 4 years, and you just don't know whether your opinions and views are even valid. So it really goes back to like, you know, you have to really put yourself in other students' shoes. And I think when I think about like the president, when I think about all the administrators making these decisions, you really have to go back to thinking about when you were a student, and go back to thinking about what did you have. Like, I think now I always flip the question. It's not like, how can we be more anti-racist and let's ask racialized people? It's like, who is, who's the administration made up of? How did you get there? What privileges do you have? What has allowed you to get there? We shouldn't be asking other people that aren't there, why aren't you here? Think about why you're there. And I think that really flips the question. I didn't have to like, it's like, I didn't have to pay for this, or I had like family support, I had this and this. So like think about people that don't do that and they're still getting through, and that extra struggle and like that baggage with racism as well. So I think we need to flip the questions around, and administration to like it, you know, acknowledge the privilege and think about what if things were different for them, if they weren't in the position they were, would they even be where they are today? And I think that's sends a more powerful response to really think about what dignity means to them and how they can share it and like make it a more equitable to access for students.
Thanks, Gurneet, for that. The next question is from somebody who runs a campus food bank at the University of Alberta. Um, like, what do you think are, so here's the question. I was wondering if the panelists could comment on students' association roles in food security programming on campuses. I run the campus food bank at University of Alberta, and I've noticed that the food banks that are run by student associations tend to be very not well resourced at all, or a priority service area for the students association. Should student associations be prioritizing or taking student food security more seriously? Maybe I'm going to ask Kayla this question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think like when it comes to why students unions are running food banks and food centers on our campuses, it's simply because there was a void, no one was doing it, and students unions were like, this is something that we need to fill. They like saw the urgency for it. They knew that this is something that had to be done. And we've kind of been trapped in this cycle of, you know, this food bank is, or food center is kind of a band-aid solution, but we can't get rid of it because we're feeding 500 people a week. But we also have like one of the smallest budgets ever for any food bank. So it's an interesting thing that kind of students associations have fallen into. And it's the tricky situation of like, well, we can't just stop because we know that this is helping so many people currently. So it's like part of like this conversation of like, what are the short-term solutions, but also what are the long-term solutions for this? And I think the unique thing about students unions running campus food banks is that we can adapt our mandates that come from the membership into the work that we do. So the times that I was the supervisor of a food bank on campus was we had conversations of like, well, are we going to call or refer to people who are coming to the food bank as users or visitors? Or what are we going to be doing when we are having conversations about consent of information, but also helping the visitors understand like, what does this mean in interacting with the volunteers at the food bank? So it was really interesting to see that we were able to apply our mandate of our anti-oppression mandate to our service center. And this is something that maybe is not available to groups such as maybe the institution itself, because there are limits when it comes to funding. So that's kind of why, you know, students unions have kind of fallen into this being a service providers, but also at the same time being a union. And I think that just is kind of like what students unions are all about, is helping our membership and taking direction from the membership of what they need, but also at the same time continuing to advocate for lower tuition, continue to advocate for donations and better sustainable funding, because yeah, food banks they are a band-aid solution. I'll fully admit that. It's not a long-term solution to these issues, but we've kind of gotten trapped into running them, because the second we don't, that's like a week where students go food insecure. So it's I don't know if that's
No, you did. I totally hear you, Kayla, and I think that very conveniently brings us towards our end of our session. And there is some clear thoughts that we got out of this conversation, and it's like it is no surprise that it is a systemic issue. It is not just a issue jumping up here and there. It's a whole systemic issue that's affecting student food insecurity. It is very evident through hearing all of you speak and through your examples that income and poverty and racial discrimination and your color of your skin, lack of better words, is a huge factor of you being food insecure. And it breaks my heart to even talk about it, but it's like it is something that we have got out of this conversation. There is a systemic change needs to happen. I know we have a lot of people here from the United States who's listening into our conversation. Things are a little different there as compared to our education system. However, we are not much better. And we recognize that. And I'm so glad that we could all come together to have this conversation. There's so much to learn from outside the network of universities and schools, from the community. Thank you all for coming. There is a feedback process that started already. If you can see it, please take a quick few seconds to give us your feedback. We would love to know what you thought about it. Thank you all, the panel. It is absolutely fantastic talking to you. And for everybody else, please keep in touch. There will be a lot more events that's coming up from February onwards, but please keep in touch. The recording of this will be on the YouTube channel at UBC as well as on our event website. So please keep it, use it wherever you need to, share with your friends and network. This is a conversation. So deepest thanks to Gurneet, Paul, Gwen, and Kayla for your time and answering these questions. Sarah and all our supporters at the university, thank you so much for coming and listening to us. Sarah, do you have anything to say in the wrap up?
Just thank you, Suman. Thank you for being our wonderful host and bringing such great energy to the conversation. And yeah, reiterating, thank you all so much for attending. And we want to keep this conversation going. So please stay connected with us. And I think that's a wrap.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Hi, just a note to the panelists, if you're still on, and the planning team, I sent out a separate Zoom link if you're able to stay and have a quick chat. Thank you. And Ryan, anything to add? Are we good?
No, I think you're all good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your support.
Thanks so much, Ryan.